Hello, everyone. This is John Shaw, the director of the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute at Southern Illinois University. Thanks for joining another installment of our series, Understanding Our New World. And we're really, really delighted to be joined by one of the wise men in the world, Jan Eliasson, a diplomat from Sweden. Jan has had an amazing career. He has done pretty much everything you can do in Swedish diplomacy. He's advised prime ministers and foreign ministers. He's been Sweden's ambassador to the United Nations. He's been their ambassador to the United States, has been a deputy foreign minister and also foreign minister. He's also had a remarkable UN career, and I don't think it's hyperbolic to say he's had more high-level positions at the UN than anyone in the UN's history. As I've mentioned, he was Sweden's ambassador to the UN, but he's also been Undersecretary General for humanitarian affairs. He's been president of the UN General Assembly. He has been a special envoy to Darfur, and he has been the Deputy Secretary General of the UN. He's also advised a number of Secretary Generals of the UN. So has had this stellar career. And the third dimension that's really interesting for us is he has a deep connection to the United States. He was an exchange student here in Decatur, Indiana in the 1950s. Was a diplomat here in the 1970s in DC, was ambassador in Washington in 2000 and 2005. In his many stints in New York at the UN, he's been in New York. So he really has had this extensive connection to the United States. I might say Jan and I have known each other for a long time. About 20 years ago, I wrote a book called The Ambassador, which chronicled Jan's diplomacy in Washington. He was, as I mentioned, Sweden's ambassador to the U.S. and did a terrific job in this book, tried to chronicle his work. And I'll say it's still in circulation in Washington. I think a lot of new diplomats trying to figure out how to find their footing in Washington have referred to this book, showing how kind of an entrepreneurial diplomat has been able to make an impression in Washington. And then just last year, I published a book, wrote a book called The Education of Statesmen, in which Jan and I had a lot of conversations about his career in diplomacy, the last part of it in particular, but also some of the broader lessons he has learned about the diplomatic world. So as this year comes to an end, and it's obviously been an extremely consequential year for the world and for the United States, I could think of no better person to help us think about it and to put it into context than my good friend Jan. So Jan is joining us from his home in Stockholm. It's almost the winter solstice, so it's already been dark there for several hours, so or at least an hour. So Jan, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, John. Great to be with you. And thanks for your very kind introduction. It was indeed a disclosure of my age, all that. Did I do that? But you are an expert of what I've done, and I thank you for this occasion to speak to you about the US and the world, I guess, and our reaction in Europe to what's going on in your country.
Yeah.
I should say that, of course, I speak very not much now in a bit of a personal capacity. I've left behind my career both in the Swedish Foreign Service and in the UN, following events from a distance, but you never lose interest in the world, and I keep in touch. But I now have the luxury of not reporting back to the ministry or to the government or to the Secretary General. So I will just have a personal conversation with you, and with you, I feel quite at ease, as you understand.
Right, right. Well, Jan, let's begin with one of your signature remarks over the years to young diplomats and even to colleagues. You've urged people to have sort of two visions in their head, a vision of the world as it should be and the world as it is. And let's start out by talking about the world as it is as 2025 comes to an end, 2026 looms. What are your sort of broad impressions of the global landscape as a year starts to end?
Well, at first, the world as it is, and just the other perspective, the world as it should be, is my way of cheering up people who now feel a little bit of political depression. Because we have seen so much of war and we have seen less of diplomacy. We have seen the climate change going on and getting worse. We have human rights violations going on all over, and we have a disrespect of international law. So in those moments, I notice younger diplomats and people I meet that they are sometimes very worried about where we are heading. And then that's why I say always, remember, you have to have a perspective of the world as it is, and another one, the world as it should be. And the world as it is means that you have to have a realistic view of the world. You can't paint a rosy picture of a world which is not very pretty right now. You've got to be good and rather rough and tough in your analysis of the world. And that is the starting point. But you wouldn't survive. You couldn't keep away cynicism if you would allow that to bring you down. So in other words, you have to always be reminded of the principles, the values, the basic issues that drive you, which go back to, in my case, the UN Charter that I always have on my desk, but also what my father and mother taught me, and what I learned in life about passion and compassion. So that's the model that I have also for my own morale, but also for instill morale in others. As to the situation of the world, I think the best word to characterize the world now is the word unpredictable. I think we are in a stage where the uncertainty is sort of going through every area of society. You have wars going on, and they don't seem to be having any diplomatic or political dimension. They just are solved by mere force or policies of spheres of interest and so forth, and disregard of international law. And in that situation, you have pillars that are now affected by particularly the change of leadership in the United States. The pillars that I think are very basic for the cohesion of democratic countries and societies is security, creating security, and the other one is maintaining and nurturing democracy. Security and democracy is what holds us together, both as nations, in my own country, Sweden, of course, and also United States traditionally. And that has been sort of the community between us that has played a tremendously important role for the quality of security and the quality of democracy. But now, with developments in both areas, we are seeing a more uncertain reality around us. We have been starting to doubt whether we have a security guarantee, whether Ukraine will be helped or not in this situation, whether diplomacy has a role at all in that conflict. And then, even on the side of democracy, I dare say that we often now, both in the US, particularly, I would think, but also in Europe, are asking ourselves, how thin is the varnish of democracy? How easily can we change our democratic societies to authoritarian societies, perhaps or even worse models later on? So those two situations have arisen, and rather surprisingly and rather quickly, and they have been growing this past year. The uncertainty about both security in Europe, in particular with the Ukraine war, but also the Gaza war, of course. And the second thing is the quality of our societies, whether democracy will be the model that we can also be proud of internationally and see gain ground as we did for so many years, self-evident, more or less. So that would be my general picture.
Well, Jan, let's talk about the last conversation we had. I happened to listen to it, which was just a week after Donald Trump was reelected. So it was I think it was November 14th, 2024. And you were, I think uncertainty might have been one of the words you used with some frequency, unpredictable as well. And you and I have been talking this last decade about, the rise of the MAGA movement, the sort of surprising arrival in 2016, its persistence through 2020, and then its return with sort of a vengeance in 2024. Um, so what is, obviously President Trump has prides himself in being a force of disruption and being unpredictable. But how has, from the vantage point of a European who has deep ties to the United States, I mean, how has the United States looked from your vantage point this last year?
Well, you mentioned my roots also in the United States, and I must say that my understanding of the US goes through this lens still. I was as you said, an exchange student in Indiana, Midwest, and in a middle class environment, and my friends were, regular guys, and I still, so many years later, are in contact with some of them. And that's why I try to understand more deeply what is going on in the United States, how this was possible to have such a drastic change of the political map, because it has also parallels in Europe. We may return to that subject. And I see that we have to ask ourselves how democracy performs and how much we deliver to people in terms of their social and economic conditions and their participation in decisions that affect their lives. What happens when they get sick? What happens when you get old? What happens if you are disabled? All these questions that, in my view, was the pillars for the key questions raised in Sweden when Sweden turned from a poor society to a welfare state and a pretty well functioning state with relative justice and equality. And I think that is in that climate of distrust, of delivering results from the side of the governments, and I say governments in plural intentionally, is the reason why we have to watch out. I react very strongly to the tendency in these movements, whether it is MAGA or extreme right-wing movements in Europe, of the simplification of realities that goes on. And not only the simplification and falsehood that can surround real events and real processes, but also the polarization of the language and the elements of even hatred, but at least deep mistrust of groups, so that the differences between different categories of people become almost unbearable in some situations, and that creates a climate in society which is, in my view, rather alarming. And this is also strengthened by the development of the social media, where I believe that it has have lots of merits, lots of advantages in terms of communications and different forms of new ways of creating democratic processes. But it is also a media without any regulation, where anything can happen, and where you can also drive those feelings, emotional feelings, in a way rather effectively, so that it almost is out of control. You can see it now, and when you don't know whether an image is manipulated or a text is manipulated. And with AI, I suppose this will even grow as an issue. So it's a complicated time, and in complicated times, those who simplify it often do it most successfully. And the last part I would say that is the most dangerous part is the demonization of your political opponents, which who often are called enemies, of course. With that white and black, and that is in a deep sense very much the issue, dimension, it becomes even more dangerous. So I believe now we have a huge challenge. We may come back to the subject, but we have a huge challenge to mobilize hope and action and good forces around those basic issues which built the kind of societies that at least I want to see. Because the present trends, in my view, are rather alarming, and we need to react against them.
Jan, as I mentioned to you offline, I was in Chicago last week and I attended a talk by a former American diplomat. So he was speaking candidly. And as the session was ending, he was asked what most surprised him about this past year in the United States. And he spoke with a kind of breathtaking directness. He said he was surprised by how fragile our institutions have proven to be. And he said how passive the American people have been in their reluctance to defend these institutions, which have been just central to American life for 250 years. I mean, you're a skilled diplomat who's very tactful, but respond to that if you would.
Well, I believe the same goes for Europe, but I've certainly drawn those conclusions from watching the American scene. I was wondering where the reactions would come from after the excesses that we saw and still see frequently from the present leadership in the White House. And it took some time before I noticed anything. That goes both for the Democratic Party, that I was expecting more from, I must say, but also from decent and many good friends in the Republican Party. This party had turned already during the first term, in my view, but even more so now, more from a party to a cult. And that I noticed that people were scared, more or less, of having raising any type of criticism, knowing that they wouldn't be reelected, because then it would mean the mobilization of MAGA with rather vehement methods and so forth of letting them know that they were not desirable anymore. And that was worrying me very much. I thought your media were and are still very good, although they are now being under pressure, and we are very worried about that, the kind of attacks on the free media that goes on. But I don't want to look like, I'm sort of sitting here giving a judgment from the outside. We have similar systems, similar tendencies with us. So it is an issue which really is now is a challenge to the whole democratic world to counter this the simplification, the demonization that goes on, and the lack of empathy and compassion on issue from every individual situation to cutting aid and not acting in favor of those who are less favored than we are in life.
President Trump released a national security strategy last week, and a number of the commentators have said that they believe the strategy downplays rather strikingly the threats from China and Russia, and instead focuses a lot of concern about Europe and about, the what it believes that, Europe is losing its European character. It's, the leadership is not strong. It's not resisting, that it's maybe intolerant. Maybe respond to both the strategy and how it's been received in Europe, and then maybe just your broader assessment of what's unfolding in Europe. I know many countries are different, and it's hard to paint with a really broad brush, but we do read about, a lot of the cross currents that are very powerfully in motion in Europe.
Well, the strategy is understandable and I would say readable on, for instance, the Asia part and possibly Latin America, although it looks very much like a sphere of interest uh, plea. But what I must say has shocked Europe is the way Europe is dealt with in this strategy. You will probably look at the public comments from the governments, and they are more cautious because they don't want to make things worse by showing the kind of concern and headache that this has caused. But I can tell you, knowing so many diplomats around Europe, that many night hours are spent analyzing this, and people coming out next morning with dreary eyes and very worried looks. And the reason is that There is sort of doubts in that strategy, both as to the issues related to security and to democracy and the way European democracy has developed and is developing. On security, it is striking that one of the most serious developments in the last 4 or 5 years is, of course, the Russian aggression and invasion of Ukraine, and it's not even mentioned. And Ukraine has become a test of how we help a democracy and a smaller country, which is under attack from a large country, a veto-wielding power in the Security Council, a nuclear power. And we have fortunately seen quite a mobilization of solidarity with Ukraine. We have some exceptions in Europe. Orban in Hungary is one. And political parties around the country and the extreme right wing are also doubtful about the support to Ukraine and the war, and have a different view. But mainly, we have a great support of that. And there you see the report more or less commending those who do not want to support Ukraine, and commending those who do not want to expand the role of the European Union, for instance, which is, of course, a very important factor and could become a global factor, both for security, together with NATO, Europe, of course, and the democracy, both for democracy and security, very key. So here we see an open attack and even an open invitation from the side of the US to cooperation with the extreme right-wing parties in Europe. You have Nigel Farage in UK, you have Le Pen in France, you have the Alternative for Deutschland in Germany, you have in the Nordic countries parties that are in the 20% category, like in my own country, who are on that same side, who do not want to see a strong Europe. And this sort of seems to be the view of this report, that the American report, that you want to deal with the countries individually, not with us as a strong Europe, a united Europe that would stand up for our own security and our own democracy. The only thing that I think has been picked up positively on the European side is the request in the strategy to strengthen our own security and pay more for defense and contribute more in the military sphere on our own. Because we have got used for so many years for the US to be in the key roles of defense. Even the commander of Europe, the NATO's commander, is American, has always been American, no other nationality. That says something about that dependency. So there I think there is a unity of view that we should strengthen our defense. But the fact that the US in that report so openly supports these extreme right-wing parties sends a signal of the kind of democracy that US would like to have, both in the US and in Europe. And that is very worrying. And I hope we can get back to, first of all, solidarity with Ukraine, and then hopefully, although there are doubts now about the strength of the US commitment to Europe. Even the Article 5 is being questioned by some. The German Chancellor Merz spoke very openly. Now the Pax Americana is practically over. He said the other day, the German Chancellor. And this would be unthinkable only 12, 14 months ago, that this could be stated. So we have a situation now where we have to turn things around, both in the area of common security, defending Ukraine and standing up for in solidarity among NATO countries, and then standing up for the kind of democracy that we were building for so long time and which now seems to be under threat.
Yeah, let's talk about Ukraine a little bit more specifically. We're coming in very close to the 4-year anniversary of the Russian invasion. There appears to be a flurry of diplomacy and negotiation. It's unclear how really serious the negotiations are. The biggest question is whether President Putin has any interest really in a diplomatic solution, or whether his view is to just let diplomacy play out as he continues to grind away at the Ukrainian people. What is your sense of the state of play in terms of negotiations on Ukraine?
Well, you know better than most people that I have spent large parts of my life in mediation and conflict resolution. I think I've been involved in 6 different crises and wars over my diplomatic life. And one of the things that I always tested when I got requests to mediate was to ask myself, do the parties want to have a political solution, a diplomatic solution? And is mediation possible? And I must say that it's hard to see the conditions being mature for mediation and successful mediation above all right now. You have a situation where one country has been attacked by a major power, and this power does not even accept the legitimacy of this nation as a state. And the requests are not only territorial, they are also requests of changing the political color of the country and moving in to create a similar government as we have in Moscow. And this is very heavy stuff. It's very heavy stuff to see that. And on the Ukraine side, I must admit that their hesitation about mediation is, of course, that if the US now leans more and more in favor of Russia, which is the impression, although it's been going back and forth, which has been rather confusing. But if US sides with Russia, more or less, on issues related to territory and NATO membership and so forth, then of course the position is so much weaker for Ukraine. And they are under deep pressure, under strong pressure now to move in that direction. And it must be a very painful situation for the Zelensky government. And for him to go into negotiation knowing that territory would be taken away from him would not only be probably a tremendous national burden to carry and vis-a-vis public opinion almost impossible to accept. But it would also be, and here comes the European perspective, it would also be against international law and against our interests in Europe. Ask the Finns or the Balts or the Poles who have seen what the invasion and aggression means and stolen territories and so forth. And to see this happen in the midst of Europe, in front of our eyes, is very hard to accept. So I think wars end and must end. But how it will end in this case is a difficult question to answer. I would think that you will still see a period of military confrontation, and hopefully with some successes from the Ukraine side, with the help of Europeans, because US will probably not contribute anymore, not maybe selling arms to Europe vis-a-vis, and then passing it on to Ukraine. But you will probably see a military period. But then, of course, there has to be such a negotiation. And the biggest issue for Zelensky will be, and the absolute stone, the requirements written in stone must be maintain sovereignty, maintain the right to create your own society, and a code word for democracy. Ukraine must come out as a democratic state and keep their own sovereignty. And the second thing must be a guarantee for Zelensky to have this not happen again. What is code word for security guarantees? And there, I think in the end, there has to be some type of model that would bring in guarantees from Europe and hopefully also from the United States. This is a minimum. The biggest and most difficult issue for Zelensky, which he now openly said, I think, a few days ago, is letting territory go. And I was in Kiev, Ukraine, when the Russians went into Crimea. And I saw that happen. And I must now, in retrospect, say that we should have reacted much more strongly when that happened. The West more or less did not accept, but did not react very strongly. And that for that we now pay a price, because it was said, well, this was historically a part of the Russia and so forth, which was partly wrong, of course. But anyway, we will probably have to wait for negotiations, but the big question will be to what extent Zelensky in the end will have to accept territorial sacrifices. And that can only be decided by the Ukrainians themselves. The only thing I can recall from my own negotiations is that sometimes you make sure that if there is something that hard pill to swallow, so to speak, you make sure that it doesn't become permanent. So when I've been in situations where I then changed the word from borders to demarcation lines or front lines, something that sort of implies that it is a temporary solution and that later we have to go back to international law. I think that would be necessary to develop. And in fact, I think if you look at the Korean situation, that armistice is not finished. It's still open for unification by principles of international law. So to sum it up, negotiation as they look now, I don't give them much of a chance, I must say. I would be surprised if it were to happen in the near future. But after some military period and perhaps a little bit diplomacy behind the scenes, a solution that would maintain Ukraine's democracy and sovereignty, and that would have as strong security guarantees as possible.
Okay. Well, another trouble spot, which you had mentioned earlier, was the horrific war in Gaza. And the UN passed a resolution in November, which effectively, as I understood it, kind of codified the Trump plan. Both China and Russia abstained, which was sort of an unusual development. The Security Council passed a resolution allowing an international stabilization force to enter. And then, of course, there's some really complex work ahead. What is your broad reading of how the Gaza situation is likely to unfold in the coming year?
Well, I feel pain and despair about the situation in the Middle East. I worked with this area for 40 years. I was involved in when Sweden tried to bring the PLO and Israel together in secret talks, which preceded the Norwegians, the Oslo Agreement in the 90s. I personally met Prime Minister Prime Minister Rabin, who was, I think, the best hope for peace at the time. And when he was turning around and accepting the Palestinian state as a principle, he was murdered. And Clinton tried when I came as ambassador in 2000. He was working hard, but it failed also at that moment where they were pretty close and where Arafat also contributed to the problems. But it had got worse and worse, and I believe now that we are so far away from the two-state solution that I can't recall a period where it's so dark, and where you have this enormous dilemma that the present ceasefire, which is a very weak and very frail ceasefire, has to move to another stage, which is a stage of withdrawal of Israeli troops and demilitarization of Hamas, and then a political process leading up to the prospect of a two-state solution. That is not even recognized by both sides. Hamas is refusing to demilitarize completely. They are coming back also on the west, in Gaza. And the Israelis don't even want to talk about the right to a Palestinian state. So it's a very tragic situation because in the meantime, the living conditions have been completely changed into a nightmare. You have had a period of of starvation, more or less, for the Palestinians in Gaza. You have had a period of forced displacement inside Gaza, that little piece of territory, back and forth 6, 7, 8, 9 times, and 80% of all buildings are destroyed. It's a moon landscape over there. And then comes the rains and the winter, and the risk is that what this forces the people to do is to simply get out. And what even more scary is that some Israelis would like that to happen. The far right wing in Israel is to me a tremendous threat to both the future of Israel, but also to international law and humanitarian law. They speak openly of not accepting Palestinians and forcing them out, both from Gaza and from the West Bank. So I asked myself, why did the Hamas come to this primitive, brutal decision to go for that October 7 brutal attack? I mean, it gave the reason for Israel to use this tremendously great power in such a way that definitely goes out of proportion. That is not in line with international law. You can't defend 70, 80,000 people killed out of 23,000 children, 80% of the buildings gone, and starvation and so forth, as a proportionate reaction to the horrible attack of October 7. So Israel has to look at this in the long-term perspective of its own future as a democratic state that wants to be part of the international community. The kind of reactions in Europe have been very strong, although I must say not as strong as I would have expected, because the extreme right-wing parties that we talked about earlier have chosen very much Israel as a partner and support the extreme right-wingers in the Israeli government, even some of them. And not to speak about Netanyahu, who manages the whole process in that direction. So it's a very difficult situation where I would hope, I have always defended Israeli interests. I even, as president of the General Assembly, was behind the decision to make 27th of January the international commemoration of Holocaust. I even have some trees planted, I think, somewhere in Israel for me. So it pains me to say this, that I am extremely disappointed in Israel going this far in its use of force, and not showing that in the end you have to have a solution for the Palestinians. They must answer the question: should the Palestinians be completely integrated into Israel? Would they accept that? Would they? Do they want them? Do they want to force them out to neighboring countries, including from the West Bank, or do they accept that there is a political process to a solution where, in the end, two nations can exist side by side with security guarantees for Israel in particular, but for both? That's the question that has to be answered. And in the present moment, Netanyahu doesn't even want to entertain that question.
Yeah, and let's talk about the UN. I mean, obviously, as I mentioned earlier, it's an institution that you spent a good chunk of your professional life working in. We don't hear a lot about the UN in this last year in the United States. I'm sure more in other parts of the world. I'm sure in Sweden. But explain what's going on in the UN now. I know for many years you've been telling me, as long as the Security Council is divided between the United States and Russia and China, the Security Council has become a venue for, very little productive work. The General Assembly has become a bit more assertive. But what's going for Americans who are saying what's going on in the UN these days? How would you answer that?
The basic problem is the mistrust that has existed and still exists between major powers, particularly US and Russia. And that has led to this overuse and misuse of the veto. stopping reasonable solutions and stopping even negotiations on processes which should be easily conducted. For instance, the Sudan tragedy. Why should that continue like that? Where are the national interests of Russia, US, and China or UK or France in Sudan? They should have forced under good diplomatic, forceful action to stop this horror. But I believe that we have to accept the fact that this mistrust is there, and that has led me to the conclusion that I would think that there is a vacuum that exists for the UN to fill. There's a vacuum offered by the Security Council immobility and lack of action, which I think should be used by the General Assembly and by the Secretary General. The General Assembly is a true democratic institution. It's we the peoples, we the governments in the General Assembly. And when they express themselves on Ukraine, 140 votes out of 192, or on the annexation of the territory of the Russians, again 140 votes. And when they express themselves on the Israeli action, it's even larger figures. That's an expression of the will of the world. And I believe that the General Assembly should be more forceful, more strong, even if their resolutions or recommendations are not binding resolutions as the Security Council resolutions are. But for instance, the Korean War was the role of the UN was defined in the General Assembly by a uniting for peace formula. So there is room for the General Assembly to take over the passivity, to increase an element of action and passion for change that is necessary to come from the UN. Secondly, I think the Secretary General, and I hope very much that we will see a woman Secretary General this year be elected before the end of next year, that she or he has a potential. I always point to an article here in this UN Charter, Article 1999, which talks about the fact that the Secretary General can call in the Security Council on any subject that relates to peace and security on any level, foreign minister level and so forth. That has not been done more than 4 times through the years. Yesterday, I heard Ban Ki-moon, my former boss. He was the Secretary General, and I was his deputy, as you know, for 5 years, as you said. And he made a proposal to the Security Council where he said that the Secretary General should be elected for 7 years, 1 term only. Why? Because presently the 5 powers can look at the Secretary General and see, is it good enough to be re-elected, which is a way of exerting pressure on the Secretary General. If he had 1 term, that would be quite an improvement. So there are ways to deal with that, but I believe that the UN is needed, mainly because UN represents what I said and you said in the very beginning, the world as it should be. We need to have a standard. We must never give up reaching those goals, the rules of international law, the human rights, and so forth. If we do that, we get stuck in the mud of the world we have around us right now.
Yeah, and you had mentioned Sudan. It's been described as the world's worst humanitarian crisis. I've seen numbers, 150,000 have been killed just in the last several years. 12 million have been displaced. You have this battle between the Sudanese armed forces and their rapid support forces. So you have these two groups battling each other. You have lots of outside powers, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, Iran, the United Arab Emirates. And I know from your diplomacy in Sudan, you are always mindful of the outside forces. So explain as briefly as you can, what's going on and how this can be brought to an end.
Well, I had hopes that Sudan could turn into a very well-functioning, good society after Bashir was overthrown, because there was for a short time a civilian government led, by the way, by a UN former official. Uh, and a great team. And the civilian side and the civil society were in there, and it was an element of vitality that I loved to see. I had mediated there, as you know, 2006 to 8, and struggled with the Darfur crisis. But then came this power, this fight for struggle for power between the army chief, the General Boran, and the leader of the RSF, which in my time was called the Janjaweed Militia. Hemeti was the head of it. And I can tell you horror stories from the time I mediated when I came to the villages and they told me about the Janjaweed militia coming on horses or camels, throwing dead dogs or dead sheep in the water wells, forcing the population to go to the huge camps. Millions of people were in those camps. And this was pure terror vis-a-vis the civilian population. And the leader of that movement is now the one that is leading the RSF. And I am astonished that he has received so much diplomatic support from the Gulf countries, particularly UAE. And it should have been disclosed much earlier what they were up to. And it is a horror. It is a big shame that we had to wait for the unbelievable cruelty that was shown in El Fasher, the capital of Darfur, by the RSF just recently, for us to get our eyes open on what was going on. And that's where I'm also very disappointed, as I told you earlier, about the Security Council not taking action. Where is the national interest of the P5, Permanent Five, to not have an action from the international, the most important organization for peace and security? So I don't know what will happen. I hope that the countries of the Gulf realize as what kind of genie they have let out of the bottle, and that there will be some type of process back to a more stable situation. There will be also has to be also more support going. We have a wonderful, a great head of the humanitarian branch of the UN now, Tom Fletcher, who is fighting for money to make sure that the programs in, for instance, Gaza and Sudan can be filled, and they aren't filled. But there is a tremendous need now for humanitarian support and development support. And there again, to come back to the US and European scene, we should be also we should be ashamed, in my view, of cutting down so much of our humanitarian and development assistance. So Sudan needs a strong Security Council resolution and hand and presence. They need a process of coming back to a civilian government. And they need a lot of humanitarian and development assistance. That should be administered by the UN, and I hope we will see a strong woman Secretary General leading that effort from 1st of January 2027.
Yeah, let's talk for a couple minutes on the climate situation, climate crisis. We had another UN summit in the last month or two that, by most accounts, did not accomplish very much. I think in one of the kind of signature statements from that summit, the Secretary General began his remarks by saying, "How much more must we suffer?" Um, so talk about the way forward on climate as you see it. I mean, are we just at a stalemate in which very little is happening, at least at the governmental level, the private sector is making some adjustments. Give us your broad assessment of that.
I hope you come to hope at the end of our conversation.
That's the next topic.
It's been pretty depressing here. I am, of course, disappointed, very much disappointed in the direction things are going now, with fossil fuel coming back in use and US leaving the Paris Agreement that we struggled to reach. And where country after country now seems to forget their promises to the Paris Agreement and also to the negotiation that I led, the Sustainable Development Goals that are languishing because of the reduction in development assistance, not least, and also humanitarian field. So the situation is pretty bad. I for one can't understand why we can't learn or come to some very civilized conclusion, namely that this is our common treasure, this earth we have been given. My daughter was once joining Greenpeace and criticized me for spending too much time with Saddam Hussein and the mullahs in Iran. And she said, Dad, you should do something different. What is that? You should negotiate peace with nature. You should negotiate peace with nature. I was smiling condescendingly at her at the time. Now I quote her in my speeches. It's absolutely right. We should learn to respect everything living. And that should be unite us. I don't understand why the Greens and are often, in my country at least, related to the left of the political spectrum. The word conservative comes from the Latin conservare, which means preserve. And everyone should unite around the saving the planet. May have planned, you have heard my line before, we may have plan B on certain sectors of our life, but there is no planet B. So I would think that in this world where we have so much strife now, so much division, we should unite around the climate change issue, around the biological diversity, around saving our oceans and air. That should be our big task, and that should unite us, both inside nations and between nations. But that doesn't happen. We sort of tend to always polarize and look at ourselves as opponents. But I think we must always keep that in mind. We may otherwise be in this situation where we just move the deck chairs on the Titanic, as they say. If we deal with these issues that are of a character of being solved in a year or two. But if we don't deal with this issue, which could threaten the whole survival for our children and grandchildren, then we are, again, as I said, just moving the chairs on the deck of Titanic.
Well, as advertised and promised, we are now shifting to hope. And I know one of your signature lines is there's always a way, there's always hope, never give up. And let's find some areas of hope. I mean, I know you had some dealings with the previous Pope, Pope Francis, who was a very, very compelling figure. We have a new Pope. We're very proud of him in Illinois since he grew up in Chicago, but is a different type of personality, but seems very balanced and positive, and just kind of an American that not mu the world doesn't oftentimes see. Many language skills and a kind of a depth and a sensitivity that is not often associated with Americans. I think many of us believe it's there, but perhaps hidden. So areas of hope. I mean, you don't need to start out with the
I
Catholic
know
Church.
you have many good people coming from Chicago,
All
and
right.
I congratulate you to Pope Leo, and I think the Church is playing a good role now, from the former Pope, but also I feel very confident and comfortable with the present Pope. And he has a tremendous tribune, a very strong voice, which should be heard. But I believe that there is hope. For instance, on the sad picture of security, the strengthening of Europe combining for our own security, speaking with one voice, hopefully, and also standing up for democracy in a world where democracy is thin. Maybe there is a thin varnish that we have, and whether we should strengthen that. So that's hope. That's also a big task for us, and I believe most Americans have in themselves also what you have been building in your own country, and your idealism is there. So I think we will see that coming out, those voices in America. I have hope in all my many friends that I treasure and are very close to me. And then I think in the long term, on structural hope, if I may use that expression, is the liberation of women. The emancipation of women will be the best news in the world in the next decades. It's going quickly. It's going back in countries like Afghanistan, but it's moving. It's moving along. And when I was Deputy Secretary General, I met 34 women prime ministers and presidents altogether, or during my time. I counted the other day. When I was there in the 90s, I think I saw 10. So that's just a sign that there is a role for women taking responsibility to have a tremendously positive economic and social and psychological effect, and for history, very important. Then I believe in young people, even if we have trouble with too many affected by social media in a negative way, but there is a great hope. We should learn to work with young people, not only for young people. We should include them in the planning of democracy and planning of jobs in the area of environment, where they have a tremendous interest. I go to schools and I notice that feeling among young people. Also, I believe in knowledge and science and research. The knowledge is a tremendous power of change and could play a very important role to save us from the climatic disaster coming if we don't do anything. And then lastly, I believe in international cooperation. I don't believe in spheres of interest which are developed now by the US and Russia and China. I believe in the respect of nation. I believe in respect in international law being the first line of defense. Respect of law, international law, is the first line of defense for small and medium-sized nations. And that is symbolized by this organization and by this charter, which we should try to keep high and keep in mind. And in my book, as you noticed, you know my books better than most, and I know yours. I finished my next to last chapter with something that my wife thought was a little bit sentimental, but I believe in. I said, after serving in diplomacy for so many years, I asked myself, what is the most important word in the world? What is the most important word in the world? And I have come to the conclusion that the most important word in the world is the word together. Together. It's only together that we can solve any of these issues, whether it is war, development, human rights, international law, or a balanced society at home, or any problem that you sit with. If you don't see that you have this need to bring in your colleagues, your friends, your allies, your other nations that play a role, or other people, organizations, science, research, business, civil society, around a problem. Put this problem in the center, as you have heard me say before, and then come out in the end with a division of labor under the heading of together. It sounds a bit idealistic, that's what my wife said, but I still come to this conclusion that it is only together that we can make it.
Well, Jan, final question. So if a young person approaches you, you're obviously hugely well known in Sweden, really around the world, but and says, "Should I be a diplomat?" What do you say?
Definitely, although right now we don't have a very thriving situation. I talked sometimes to my friends who have helped me in my negotiations, and they almost feel unemployed because people only go for so-called military solutions. So diplomacy and dialogue and compromise and conflict resolution is not à la mode. But I believe that this is the most civilized way to reach conclusions and find solutions. Diplomacy is using the word. Diplomacy is timing. Diplomacy is cultural sensitivity. Diplomacy is respect of other human beings and having an honest and sincere personality so that you then instill trust. And after a life in diplomacy, I feel tremendously grateful and privileged to have done that. So I just advise those who have those plans to be interested in the world outside. I always quote Shakespeare, there is a world outside Verona. Romeo says, no, the friar Lorenzo says to Romeo when he has to leave town because of family feud. He says, there is a world outside Verona, and there is a world outside Europe, there is a world outside the US, with which we should feel compassion and solidarity and companionship and see that we also need them and they need us. And that belief will guide me, and I think it must guide future diplomacy. And then from an individual point of view, gather experiences, go out and practice, be a trainee, go out, work with the Doctors Without Borders or Save the Children or Red Cross, and get involved in political parties so that you vitalize also democracy. There are lots of things that you can do, and I believe more and more that diplomacy should be seen both in the international context and the national context. If you build good and strong and healthy nations on the basis of democracy and security of our nations, then you also contribute to international security. But that security must be built on diplomacy and not on military confrontation and continued wars. Right now, we are in a period of strains on the peace traditions and on the solidarity traditions and on the human rights traditions. But I remain not optimistic, maybe a worried optimist still. But I believe that these qualities, these areas are so important that we cannot desert them. We must come back to them in order to live the kind of life that we should be proud of in the end. So definitely go for diplomacy. As long as I'm around, I can continue to advise them. Perhaps via you, but your book is a good start. Your books is a good start. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jan, for another terrific conversation in which I think we've discussed the world as it is and also ended with the world as it should be. And I will say, speaking of books, this is Jan's memoir that was published in Sweden a couple of years ago. Word in Action, I believe, is the best translation. I've read it through Google Translate. It's a terrific book, wonderful stories, wonderful meditation on diplomacy. I've written two books, as I've said earlier on Jan. They all three would be great Christmas presents if people are still looking to get something for their friends and family. So, but yeah, just to conclude, I mean, obviously a tremendous conversation again. It's always fun to chat with you and hear about, the world as it is and the world as it should be, and look forward to staying in touch. Still want to get back to Sweden soon. Probably not in the winter. Spring and summer seems a little bit more compelling, but really look forward to having a chance to visit you either in Stockholm or your beloved Gotland.
You're always welcome, and I want to thank you for this conversation. And I also want to pass on greetings for the holidays to the people who have followed this conversation. I'm glad there is definitely among so many an interest in the world outside Verona, and that we should try to unite around some basic principles of decency and justice that we fail to see around the world in many places today. But thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you, Jan. Thank you so much. And thanks to all of you for watching another installment of our series. We will have a video of this conversation on our website in the next day or two. Please look at it, show it to family and friends. Thank you for supporting the Institute, keeping the memory of Paul Simon alive and well. Thank you so much.